Hello and welcome to the webinar, Zero Emission Vehicle Awareness, Session 2. My name is Danielle Fisher and I'm the Lead Event Manager for Eco Canada, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping guidelines for today's session to ensure that everyone can enjoy and participate in the webinar effectively. All participants are muted, so please check your audio settings to ensure that you can hear us properly. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the question box and select Eco Canada, the organizer, and I will do all that I can to resolve the issue. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand to you within the next 24 hours. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive an email with a link to the video. Any questions that you have about the presentation or today's topic can be submitted through the chat box or question box. We will have dedicated time after the presentation to answer any questions from the audience. Finally, we really want to know what you think about our webinars and how we can keep improving. You will be sent a short survey after the webinar ends. Please let us know what you think or if you have any comments or suggestions about the webinar. I'll now hand it over to Logan Highland. Logan is a project associate for the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre and Sustainability Services for the Alberta municipalities. Over to you, Logan.
Hello everyone, my name is Logan Hoyland and welcome to the second webinar in the three-part webinar series about zero-emission vehicle myths and misconceptions, basic function, and the future of electric vehicles in Canada. These webinars have been developed and are being presented by Eco Canada in partnership with the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre through the federal government's Zero-Emission Vehicle Awareness Initiative. The Municipal Climate Change Action Centre respectfully acknowledges that we live, work, and play on the traditional and ancestral territories of many Indigenous, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. We recognize that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples presently subject to Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, and 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta. This presentation is being delivered from Edmonton, Alberta. We respect the courageous and resilient community leadership of Indigenous peoples of all ages, knowledge keepers and elders, those who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation, gratitude, and commitment to pursuing an inclusive, collaborative, and respectful path towards building strong communities. For those of you who are not familiar with the Action Centre, we were established in 2009 as a collaborative initiative between Alberta municipalities, the rural municipalities of Alberta, and the government of Alberta. The Action Centre provides technical assistance and education to Alberta municipalities, nonprofits, and schools in addressing climate change. Since 2009, we have managed a variety of programs that have made a significant impact throughout Alberta, including working with 389 unique participants to complete 830 projects and catalyze $155 million in clean energy lifetime savings. About Eco Canada, Eco Canada's vision is to build the world's leading environmental workplace. Eco Canada seeks to help environmental workers succeed at each step of their career journey. To do this, Eco Canada has developed several programs tailored to individuals at different stages of their careers. Looking at this webinar's agenda, there are 6 key topics we will be addressing. What are common EV myths and misconceptions? EV range and range anxiety. What are the environmental impacts of EVs? EV batteries, degradation, and end-of-life uses. What impacts EVs have on the electrical grid. And finally, a brief overview of the current Canadian charging network. Despite the increasing popularity of EVs throughout Canada, there are still many myths, misconceptions, and misinformation regarding EV capability and functionality and environmental impact. 4 of the most common myths and misconceptions are that EVs do not have enough battery range to meet the needs of most Canadians, that EVs are actually worse for the environment compared to internal combustion engine vehicles, EV batteries degrade and lose range quickly and need to be disposed of often, And finally, that the current electrical grid infrastructure won't be able to support a massive influx of new electric vehicles. In this webinar, we will take a deeper look into each of these misconceptions and dispel some of this misinformation. The first myth we will investigate is EV range and range anxiety. Range anxiety is the fear that an EV will not have a great enough battery capacity and therefore range to meet the needs of a driver. For many Canadians, EV range is often the #1 concern or deterrent when considering purchasing an electric vehicle. While the range of EVs is less than most internal combustion engine vehicles, its impact is often overblown for most drivers and their daily driving habits and needs. It is important to consider range when looking into purchasing an electric vehicle, but also consider your own daily driving habits. On average, how far do you commute daily? Do you have access to home or public charging infrastructure? And how often are you going on trips upwards of 300 to 400 kilometers? While it is important to consider the range of an EV, almost all new EVs will meet the daily driving requirements of most Canadians. The average new EV has an estimated range of around 342 kilometers, while most Canadians only drive about 42 kilometers per day. This means that even on the coldest days, when an EV may lose 40 to 50% of its range, an EV will still meet the needs of most Canadians. Another important thing to remember is that battery technology and the EV charging infrastructure are continually improving and growing. Over time, EVs will continue to have greater ranges and there will be more publicly available charging stations throughout the country. Another option for Canadians are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. PHEVs are a great intermediate option for Canadians who live in more rural areas with limited charging infrastructure. PHEV owners can utilize the 40 to 50 kilometers of all-electric range for shorter commutes while still having the internal combustion engine as a backup for longer trips. Looking at this table, you can see the estimated range in kilometers and battery capacity in kilowatt hours for several new electric vehicles. The estimated ranges are based upon standard driving conditions. In the table, you can see that the range varies depending on vehicle type and battery capacity. EVs with greater ranges, like the Tesla Model S, have a higher purchase price compared to EVs like the Hyundai Kona, which has a smaller range of 395 kilometers. As EV demand in battery technology continues to improve, Canadians will begin to see EVs at more affordable prices and greater ranges. Next, we will investigate myth 2, the environmental impact of electric vehicles. EVs are portrayed as a more environmentally friendly option compared to internal combustion engine vehicles. However, there is a significant amount of misinformation regarding the actual environmental impact of EVs, including the materials needed, how batteries are manufactured, and the energy used. When looking at the environmental impacts of EVs, it's critical to consider the entire life cycle of the vehicle itself. This includes the vehicle and battery manufacturing phase, the use of the vehicle on the road, the sources of electricity and fuel in both the manufacturing and use phases, and what happens to the vehicle and the battery after the vehicle is no longer on the road. To really understand the environmental impact, we will look at each of these phases specifically. In this diagram, you can see a simplified life cycle of an electric vehicle. The life cycle is broken down into 3 distinct phases: the manufacturing phase, the use phase, and the end-of-life phase. During the manufacturing phase, both energy and materials are required to build both the battery and general car components. A direct byproduct of EV manufacturing are a variety of greenhouse gas emissions. The next phase, the use phase, can last for several years depending on how long the EV capabilities meet the requirements of the driver. During the use phase, electricity is required to power the vehicle. However, unlike an internal combustion engine vehicle, there are no greenhouse gas emissions directly created during the vehicle's operation. Finally, the end of use phase presents several options, including battery reuse, battery recycling, or battery disposal. When looking at the manufacturing phase of electric vehicles, there are three key components to consider: the fuel cycle, the batteries, and the non-battery components. The fuel cycle components considers the type of energy that is used during the manufacturing process. As EV manufacturing is a very energy-intensive process, the type and source of energy used has a major impact on the overall impact of the electric vehicle. If an EV is manufactured in a country that relies heavily on coal or fossil fuel generated electricity, the overall environmental impact will be greater than an EV manufactured in a country which primarily uses renewable energy. The second major component of EV manufacturing is the battery pack itself. Due to the size, materials required, and energy needed, the battery manufacturing process has a significant environmental impact as well. Several rare earth metals such as cobalt and lithium are critical for EV batteries. It's important to remember that there is no perfect scenario where vehicle production and use has no negative environmental impacts. The mining processes for procuring these rare earth metals do have a negative environmental impact. However, as we will see shortly, it's important to consider the entire environmental impact of an EV when comparing them to internal combustion engine vehicles. The final major component of electric vehicle manufacturing are the non-battery components, such as the vehicle frame, tires, electronics, and windows. The manufacturing process is very similar to that of an internal combustion engine vehicle. Looking at the entire manufacturing process, EVs typically have a greater negative environmental impact due to their greater energy requirements and the reliance on a variety of rare earth metals. However, it's important to understand that the environmental impact is highly dependent on where the EV is manufactured. Over the next several years, we will see more EVs undergo production in both Canada and in the US, both of which use electricity, which is considerably greener compared to many countries where EVs are being produced today. As more and more renewable energy sources are added to the electrical grid, the environmental impacts of EVs will continue to decrease. In December of 2022, the Canadian federal government and General Motors announced that a current GM manufacturing plant in Ontario will be converted into an EV-only plant capable of producing 50,000 EVs annually by 2025. Next, we will consider the use phase of electric vehicles. It's important to remember that EVs do not directly produce greenhouse gas emissions during operation like internal combustion engine vehicles. However, EVs do require electricity, which can be produced by a variety of sources. EVs used in provinces like BC or Quebec will use electricity sourced primarily from renewable sources such as hydro, while EVs used in Alberta often use electricity generated primarily from natural gas. However, despite the natural gas sourced electricity, EVs will still have a decreased environmental impact due to the efficiency of the electric motors compared to internal combustion engines and the absence of greenhouse gas emissions during operation. As more and more renewable energy sources are added to the grid, the environmental impact of EVs will continue to decrease. In this slide, we can see the major sources of electricity generation throughout Canada in 2019. Each area of the country differs in their main source of electricity. Both BC and Quebec generate most of their electricity through hydro sources, while Ontario uses a mix of both nuclear and hydro sources. The Prairies, Atlantic Canada, and the Territories rely on a variety of sources such as natural gas, coal, petroleum, wind, and hydro. As more renewable energy sources are added throughout the country, the electricity used within electric vehicles will become greener, which makes the vehicles even more environmentally friendly. In this graph, we can compare the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of a 2019 conventional internal combustion engine car and a 2019 Nissan Leaf with a 40 kilowatt-hour battery pack. The emissions are based upon 150,000 kilometers driven over the vehicle's lifetime and the United States electrical grid. Overall, the internal combustion engine vehicle produces approximately 258 grams of CO2 per kilometer, while the Nissan Leaf produces roughly 130 grams of CO2 per kilometer. This is approximately 50% less compared to the internal combustion engine vehicle. Most notably, the use phase from the ICE vehicle produces the most greenhouse gas emissions at 165 grams of CO2 per kilometer when comparing both vehicles and all phases. The battery production and fuel cycle account for around 92 grams of CO2 per kilometer when looking specifically at the Nissan Leaf. Overall, when considering the environmental impact of EVs, it's critical to consider both the manufacturing and use phases. On average, EVs emit approximately 50 to 60% less greenhouse gas emissions per kilometer compared to their internal combustion engine vehicle counterparts. As more and more renewable energy is added to the grid, the environmental impacts, both during manufacturing and use, will continue to decrease. The third myth focuses on battery degradation and end-of-life uses for electric vehicle batteries. A common misconception is that EV batteries degrade very quickly, which can require drivers to either replace the batteries or purchase a new vehicle, both of which are costly. While EV batteries do degrade and lose storage and range capacity over time, this is a natural occurrence of all batteries and often does not impact drivers severely. Battery degradation varies from vehicle to vehicle and is dependent on usage, driver habits, and a variety of other factors such as heating and charging. Typically, an EV will lose 1 to 2% battery capacity per year. However, this degradation varies between EVs and may not be linear year over year. In this graph, we can see a study that was completed by Geotab, in which 6,300 different EVs were analyzed over a period of time to gain a better understanding of battery degradation. From the study, it was found that on average, an EV loses around 2% of usable capacity per year. However, this degradation is not always linear. EV drivers may see an initial steep drop in range after purchase, followed by a slow drop over the next few years, followed by another steep drop after the vehicle has seen substantial use. It's important to remember that battery degradation is unique to each EV and is related to the driving habits of the driver. Looking at a real-life example, the 2023 Hyundai Kona has an estimated initial range of 415 kilometers. Assuming a 2% loss in range per year, Kona owner can expect around a 76 kilometer loss in range after 10 years. This reduces the usable range to approximately 339 kilometers. Despite this reduction, this range of 339 kilometers still far exceeds the average daily driving requirements of most Canadians, which is around 42 kilometers. Even on the coldest days, this decreased range after 10 years will still meet the needs of most Canadians driving EVs. It's important to remember that battery degradation and loss in range does not have a significant impact on the driver until the decreased range of the EV does not meet the requirements of the driver. While battery degradation is a natural process of all batteries and can't be stopped, there are several ways it can be slowed in order to prolong battery life. One, whenever possible, try to avoid excess DC fast charging. While fast charging is both convenient and sometimes needed, it does generate a significant amount of heat, which can stress the battery. Two, try to avoid operating and charging the battery in extreme heat. Extreme heat can cause damage to EV batteries, just like it can cause internal combustion engine vehicles to overheat. While extreme cold can temporarily reduce battery capacity, extreme heat can permanently damage and reduce battery capacity. Lastly, try to keep the battery state of charge between 20 and 80%. When batteries are nearly depleted or fully charged, it can damage the battery over time. Shifting to the end of use phase, the disposal, replacement, and reuse of EV batteries is a relatively new concern and concept, as there are still very few EVs that have been in operation for an extended period of time. After an EV no longer meets the needs of the driver, there are several options for both vehicle and battery. First is battery replacement. There is a significant amount of misinformation regarding replacement and its practicality for most EV drivers. Typically, EV battery warranty is 8 to 10 years or 160,000 kilometers. This means that the useful life expectancy of the battery is often longer than the vehicle itself. For perspective, a new Ford vehicle sold in Canada has a basic warranty of only 3 years up to 60,000 kilometers. Currently, battery replacement is not typical for most EV drivers as it can be quite expensive. For most EV drivers, purchasing a new vehicle with a new battery is often a better option than trying to replace the used battery. If an EV driver does decide to purchase a new electric vehicle, there are several options for the used battery. The first being battery repurposing. Battery repurposing is when the battery is removed from the vehicle as it no longer meets the needs of the driver and is used in a different way. Even after 10 years of use in an EV, a spent battery is still capable of storing large amounts of energy. This makes used EVs excellent for complementary energy storage with renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. For example, after 10 years of use in a 2023 Hyundai Kona, the Kona will still have a capacity of roughly 51 kilowatt hours. This is a lot of energy. A Tesla Powerwall, which is often tied into residential solar PV systems, has a capacity of 13.5 kilowatt hours. Even after 10 years of use in a vehicle, a used Kona battery can still store upwards of 3.5 times more energy than a new Powerwall. A Canadian example of battery repurposing is an initiative being completed by BC Moment Energy and the Government of BC. With this initiative, Moment Energy will be using retired EV batteries to supplement renewable energy systems in remote communities that rely heavily on diesel generation. In doing so, the communities can reduce diesel consumption and ensure electrical stability with added energy storage. If a battery is not repurposed or after it has been repurposed, another option is battery recycling. Large-scale battery recycling is still a very new technology and industry due to the limited number of EVs which are no longer on the road. However, battery recycling will play a key role in the EV industry going forward, as efficient and affordable recycling will reduce the demand for rare earth mineral mining. As more and more Canadians adopt EVs, having large-scale recycling facilities will be critical. Currently, there are two main techniques which are used to recycle batteries and recover metals: pyrometallurgy and hydrometallurgy. Pyrometallurgy requires the batteries to be heated and smelted at very high temperatures. The byproduct is then separated and some of the rare earth metals are recovered. The other recycling technique, hydrometallurgy, is a far more efficient and sustainable form of recycling. Batteries are dissolved in a variety of solvents, with the majority of the rare earth metals being recovered. The metals can then be returned to battery production supply chains. Two North American companies which currently recycle batteries at large scale are Li-Cycle and Redwood Materials. Li-Cycle is a Canadian-based company which is rapidly expanding throughout North America and Europe, while Redwood Materials is an American-based company started by the former Chief Technical Officer of Tesla. The fourth and final myth focuses on the impact EV adoption will have on the electrical grid. A common misconception is that the current electrical grid will not be able to support the mass adoption of EVs we expect to see over the next several years. While EVs will significantly increase both the electrical load and power demand, electrical utilities and providers are very aware of the impacts EVs will have and have already began developing the necessary infrastructure to accommodate more EVs. As this transition will happen gradually over the next 30 years, utility providers have time to adapt and develop required energy generation and distribution infrastructure. According to a report completed by ICF, a consulting firm working on behalf of Natural Resources Canada, many system planners perceive low vulnerability and risk in terms of EV adoption, and that the adoption of electric vehicles is a great business opportunity due to the additional load. In this graph, we can see the projected electrical load of EVs nationwide, assuming all light and medium duty vehicles are fully electric by 2050. In this graph, we see a steady increase in annual load from 2030 through 2045, with the expected load being approximately 156 terawatt hours by 2050. To put that in perspective, in 2019, Canada produced around 632 terawatt hours of electricity. The annual electrical load of EVs in Canada in 2050 is projected to be around 156 terawatt hours, which is approximately 25% of all the electricity that is generated annually in Canada today. Adding 156 terawatt hours of electrical load by 2050 is very similar to adding the entire electrical capacity of Ontario's grid today. In the table on the right, we can see the expected national electrical load for EVs in 2030, 2040, and 2050. This table outlines the expected battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle load in each province in 2030, 2040, and 2050, and the actual load of each province in 2020 in gigawatt hours. This projection assumes all light and medium duty vehicles will be electric by 2050. Putting everything together, adding a massive influx of electric vehicles to the grid does present a challenge to providers and utilities. However, as the adoption will take place over a 30-year time period, both utilities and providers have time to upgrade and add required infrastructure. Additionally, technological improvements in EVs, such as bidirectional charging, presents itself as an opportunity to reduce load and power demand. Bidirectional charging allows the grid to take electricity from a charged EV in times of high demand to reduce stress on the grid. Then, when demand is reduced, the grid can recharge the EV. Things such as bidirectional charging and charging management systems will play a key role in reducing electrical load and demand. A few other common EV myths and misconceptions are: 1, that EVs don't work well in Canadian winters. While EV range can be reduced up to 50% on the coldest days, EVs actually operate extremely well in Canadian winters. Due to the composition of the lithium batteries, the battery pack in an EV will never die like a battery in an internal combustion engine vehicle. This means that as long as the EV has some stored energy, it will always start. Also, EVs are significantly heavier compared to similar internal combustion engine vehicles, which improves driver control when driving through snow and ice. Another myth is EVs are too expensive to repair. However, as we covered in webinar 1, EVs are actually around 50% cheaper to maintain each year as they have significantly fewer moving parts. Also, EV batteries are typically under warranty for 8 to 10 years or up to 160,000 kilometers, meaning most drivers will not have to pay for any battery failures. Finally, another misconception is that EVs are unsafe. However, the opposite is actually true. EVs are safer than most internal combustion engine vehicles. As EVs do not have an engine, this allows them to have more safety features built in to protect the occupants of the vehicle. Also, the added weight of the battery makes EVs less likely to roll and improves driver control. Finally, we'll take a brief look at the current Canadian charging network landscape. This graph outlines the number of publicly available level 2 and level 3 charging stations throughout Canada as of June 2022. Currently, Quebec, Ontario, and BC respectively have the most level 2 and level 3 charging stations. This picture provides a good visual of where the majority of EV charging stations are located throughout the country. As you can see, most chargers are located in the major urban centers throughout the country. There are still significant gaps throughout rural areas of Canada. In webinar 3, we will take a look at charging station incentives, targets, and future infrastructure in more depth. And that brings us to the end of webinar 2. In webinar 3, we will be addressing the common pillars of EV uptake in Canada, EV policy, government and manufacturer targets, EV incentive programs, and how Canadians can benefit from the EV transition. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar presented by EcoCanada and the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre. I hope you found it helpful. If you have any questions about this webinar or any of the topics, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, Logan. Very informative, very, very interesting. We do have a few questions for you. So,
For sure.
Absolutely. So the first kind of question or comment is, we need to install EV charge points at places where people gather, like highway rest stops, hospitals, every municipality, especially in rural areas where distance limitations are significantly larger than the 42-kilometer average. For instance, mine is 200 per day. What do you have to say about that, Logan?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Right now, EV range and especially charging infrastructure deployment is definitely a concern. If you go to more rural areas of the province, there are a lot of dead spots, a lot of areas where we don't have enough charging for a lot of drivers on the coldest days, and that's something businesses are aware of. They're looking into installing a lot of chargers at their own places of business. Municipalities are aware of it as well, understanding as more and more people begin to adopt EVs, that having charging infrastructure at those locations where lots of people are meeting, lots of people are gathering is going to be critical. And then businesses such as Petro-Canada and Shell, they're also looking into the deployment of DC fast chargers as well, really trying to build out that grid and building resilience so EV drivers are confident that they know wherever they're traveling, there will be options for charging. But right now, it's definitely a concern. There's a lot of areas where there does need to be improvement for sure.
Mm-hmm. Our next question is, what is the cost of replacing an electric motor if it fails?
That's a good question. To be honest, I'm not entirely aware of the actual costs. It's really dependent on the vehicle itself. As I mentioned, I think earlier, typically the vehicles are under warranty for 8 to 10 years or 160,000 kilometers. Depending on the vehicle type, the electric motors are often included in that as well.
Mm-hmm. The third question, in your research, did you come across statistics on internal combustion engine component recycling rates at end of life?
No, that's a good question. I'm not aware, to be honest. I know a lot of the components can be reused in a variety of ways, but no, I'm not aware exactly of how many components are reused and how many are repurposed in other applications.
Mm-hmm. What about charging in extreme cold? Most batteries have a hard time charging in extreme cold, don't they?
Yeah, that is true. So, for example, if you're minus 30 in the minus 40 range, the amount of power that can be delivered to the vehicle is going to be decreased. However, there are a couple ways that can be mitigated and improved. For example, if you're driving for a significant distance, you have to pull over and charge. Your EV battery is already going to be preconditioned. It's going to be a little bit warmer, so then it's able to accept a little bit more charge. And then even if it's cold, you plug in initially, the kilowatt hours or the kilowatts going into the battery are going to be less. However, as more and more go into the battery battery is going to heat up a little bit and it's going to be able to accept more charge. But yes, when the temperatures are very cold, the amount of power that can be delivered is definitely decreased.
Mm-hmm. For the GHG emissions per kilometer slide, does the Nissan Leaf's calculation assume 100% renewable electricity? If so, do you have the total that the kilowatts per hour used for the 150,000 kilometers driven?
So for that slide specifically, the electricity used is based upon the 2019 US electrical grid. So I don't have the specific numbers for what the renewable energy sources were. There is a variety of wind, solar, coal, natural gas, a variety of different sources. It's similar to the electrical grid in Canada, but no, I don't know the specific amount of renewable energy that led to that specific graph.
Mm-hmm. How about, are EVs a good option for those living without a garage?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely something to consider. It is more difficult right now to have an EV without a garage and without a dedicated parking spot to charge. If you don't have a garage, there are several options, such as curbside charging. There are more and more being deployed throughout cities, as well as fast charging at central hubs, and then trying to utilize charging at workplaces, things like that. If you don't have a garage, you can utilize just a typical 120 volt wall outlet. It is slower than a level 2 charger. However, it will charge your vehicle. If you're only driving 50 to 60 kilometers per day, you come home, you plug into that, it typically can recharge your battery overnight.
Mm-hmm. Christopher is wondering, what temperature is considered extreme heat?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact number. I know when operation gets over 40, 45 degrees, it can definitely be detrimental to the battery, but the exact temperature itself, I'm not exactly aware of.
Scott is asking, EV have a 50% reduction to ICE, but what is the benefit to actually attempting to remove personal vehicles from the road as an alternative? Is this a better goal with a better return than electrification?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, ultimately, not driving or using options such as public transit, biking, walking, carpooling, that's always a better option than driving in your own vehicle by yourself. If you're able to, utilize public transit, if more people on one vehicle, of course, that's going to be a better option than having your own vehicle. Whenever possible, that's the best option. But for some people, it's not always applicable.
Mm-hmm. Ben asks, is battery warming technology continuing to improve?
Yes, there's always improvements in terms of the battery technology. I know for EVs specifically to Canada, they're looking into different technologies and ways that the batteries can be preheated or warmed during operation, really trying to maximize the capacity and the range that is in the vehicles themselves.
Mm-hmm. What is the emissions calculation for the recycling of the batteries?
The emission calculations. That's difficult. It's a good question. To be honest, I don't know 100% because it's such a new industry and field. Because there are such limited EVs, or so few EVs that have reached their end of life, we really don't know the large scale picture of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the actual recycling process. We do know that as EVs reach their end of life, if they can be reused as complementary energy storage and then recycled, that's going to decrease their overall greenhouse gas emission impacts. But the amount that are a direct result of the recycling is still kind of yet to be determined, as more and more EV batteries are recycled on a larger scale.
How do you see EVs measuring up against the onset of hydrogen-powered vehicles?
Yeah, it's another really good question. Hydrogen is definitely a unique opportunity and also has a lot of challenges. Right now, I would say that electric vehicles are winning in that race in terms of hydrogen vehicles or electric vehicles, just because we already have an electrical grid installed. We're able to upgrade distribution and transmission of the electrical grid rather than build out a large-scale hydrogen transportation grid. Hydrogen transportation or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles can be great in more small-scale kind of applications. So for example, city buses, where you know how far the bus is going to be traveling each day, it has a similar route and it returns to the same location. You're then able to build in the hydrogen infrastructure just for that, depot where the buses are going to be parking every night, where they can be refueled. For individual use, hydrogen presents a lot of challenges in terms of production. It can require a significant amount of energy to produce the hydrogen, hydrogen storage, and transportation as well.
Mm-hmm. How do you think an EV would react to having a snowplow and sander put on it? How would this affect the range?
For example, using like a more heavy-duty type EV.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's another good question. Right now, there aren't too many large-scale electric vehicle or heavy-duty EVs. Right now, the biggest size you can really get for passenger would be the Ford Lightning, I guess, which is possible. But on a larger scale, there aren't too many heavy-duty electric vehicles that are used in those applications yet. However, it would be possible.
Where is the cobalt required for EV batteries sourced?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So right now, the majority of cobalt is from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which presents several challenges and concerns. I'm by no means an expert in the procurement of the minerals themselves. Right now, we are aware, EV manufacturers, consumers, governments, businesses are aware that there are concerns and challenges with human rights issues and the ethical procurement of those materials and minerals, specifically cobalt. And they are looking into that, and they are trying to figure out ways to improve those conditions or maybe source cobalt from other countries. I know that GM recently signed a large contract with Glencore, and they will be procuring 100% of their cobalt for all new GM vehicles from Australia.
Mm-hmm. Robert asks, regarding safety, in the case of vehicle accidents, fire appears to be a major problem for emergency services to deal with. What work is being done on this?
Yeah, that's another great question. It is a concern, specifically for emergency services. I believe that it's the Canadian Safety Association. They're currently undergoing a lot of research on innovation to look into developing standards and regulations for EV battery safety, and then common practices for dealing with fires in EV collisions and stuff like that. But definitely a concern.
Hmm. When the battery is to be recycled for other uses, are the companies going to pay me for that?
That's a really good question. That's something that is still kind of up in the air right now in terms of who owns the materials, who owns any associated carbon credits or anything like that in terms of the battery recycling supply chain. So right now, because it's such a new industry, because there's so few EV batteries that are being recycled, there are no firm rules or regulations in terms of who actually owns that, who's getting paid for the different materials and stuff like that. But it will be something to look into kind of in the future for sure.
Mm-hmm. I think this is another future question, but are there going to be incentives for homeowners to upgrade the electrical in their home for the charging stations?
Yes and no. I don't know, to be honest. It's really dependent on where you're located and utility providers. Depending on your service, if it's either underground or above ground, it can really impact the charge or impact the cost. It's really dependent, I guess, on where you live and the wire service providers specifically.
Bernadette says, with regards to the northwest area of Alberta, our electricity bills are significantly higher than many others of Alberta. At this time, the acceptance of adding to our electricity usage billing may be a negative. Utility bills are in the forefront of many people's minds as everything is going up. Electricity is higher than paying for fuel. Is this being considered?
Yeah, that's another great question, and it's definitely something to consider. Yes, I do believe that people are aware of the increased electricity costs, and for right now, for some people, specifically in northwest Alberta, EV adoption might not be practical right now, just based upon the costs of electricity and the cost of ownership.
Mm-hmm. A couple more questions here. Regarding end-of-life use, the Hyundai Kona battery, given the proprietary nature of batteries, how could that battery physically be utilized or mounted, etc.? Is it practical?
There are several challenges with removing batteries, doing so safely, removing charge, and then installing them so they supplement renewable energy sources. It is possible. I do know that rule and regulation services are looking into how they can develop a more streamlined approach, so removing used EV batteries will become simpler, easier, and more economical.
Mm-hmm. What is the typical cost to upgrade the average house to install an EV charging station?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact cost of the service upgrade. It's really dependent on the wire service provider and where your house is located and your current panel. Typically, though, for a level 2 charger to be installed in your house, just actually not to be installed, to be purchased, is around $700 to $900 to purchase. However, not every driver needs to have an upgrade, and drivers can utilize 120-volt wall outlets if possible.
Mm-hmm. Regarding grid impact, current approaches to the greening of our power grid appears to be poorly thought out. For instance, I understand that windmills, solar replaces continuous duty-based load generation. The Texas disaster last year comes to mind. What work is being done on planning to ensure that max demand in worst case scenarios will be accommodated?
Yeah, another good question. There are lots of concerns in terms of making sure we can meet that baseline demand as well as any increased power surges. As more and more wind is being added to the grid, it's definitely increasing that. Energy storage will play a critical role. Right now, we don't have a great technology that is able to store lots of energy over extended period of time. So really managing charging systems, so incentivizing off-peak pricing, so incentivizing EV drivers to charge during the night rather than right at 5 o'clock when the power demand is increasing across the province. That'll definitely be a key component, and then just trying to really make sure we can meet that baseline as well as any power surges from the grid.
And that brings us to the end of our questions for this portion of the webinar. I just wanted to let everyone know that this will be recorded and will be provided to you within 24 hours of its rendering. Please join us for the session 3 of the ZEVI webinar series, which will be on February 15th. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Logan. This is very informative. Really, really appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.